Crime in the City.
Hi friends, welcome to Crime in the City, the blog and podcast dedicated to the true crime and cold cases of New York. I'm your New York City host Cece, and today's episode will take us down the dark, twisted road of a serial killer who terrorized New York from the late 80s to early 90s. During my Halloween episode where we covered Peter Bronstein, I mentioned that he was cell neighbors with Joel Rifkin, who is possibly New York's most prolific serial killer. Between 1989 and 1993, Joel Rifkin brutally murdered over a dozen women. After nearly 5 years of instilling fear into the women of New York and evading police, his reign of terror came to an end on June 28, 1993. It's not very often you get to call a serial killer a dumbass, but Joel Rifkin was truly a dumbass. I know I typically end with the arrest reports, but I just can't wait to tell you about it, so we're switching it up today. The year was 1993. Grunge music was rockin' hard, especially the greatest band in existence, Pearl Jam. The top movies of the year were Jurassic Park and Mrs. Doubtfire. Police began their investigation into Michael Jackson's pedophilia. Women were not allowed to wear pants on the U.S. Senate floor until 1993, until Senators Barbara Mikulski and Carol Moseley Braun staged their defiant protest by wearing pantsuits to the Senate floor. Hats off to these queens for ending an absurd restriction. Apartheid finally ended in South Africa. The first episode of The X-Files aired, making the world want to believe. And finally, an episode of Seinfeld aired that year where Elaine was dating a man whose name was Joel Rifkin, the serial killer we'll be discussing today. She suggested that he change his name to OJ, like O.J. Simpson. A year later, OJ would be charged with the infamous double murder. Now that we're all caught up, let's hop in the Delorean and head back. We are inputting June 28, 1993, East Meadow, Long Island, 3:15 a.m. And we're off. It's a hot summer night out on Long Island. State troopers Deborah Spargarin and Sean Ruane were stuck with the graveyard shift. It's 3 in the morning and they're driving around patrolling the Southern State Parkway in East Meadow. It's an ordinary night, not a lot happening during this hour. In an instant flash of career-making luck, they spot a truck without a rear license plate. Seemed like a routine event, one they surely had done a dozen times before. The driver wasn't speeding, but driving without a license plate is still a minor violation, so they turned on their flashing lights to signal the driver to pull over. The driver didn't stop. The troopers then used their loudspeaker to tell the driver to pull over. This didn't work either. Instead, the driver slammed the gas and sped off the next ramp exit into the streets of Wantagh. The troopers called in for backup as they chased the driver at 90 miles an hour. 5 more police cars joined. Everyone had their sirens and lights flashing. He took a turn at about 90 miles per hour and the truck had gone up on just the 2 wheels on one side, half in the air before landing back down on all 4. The whole high-speed chase lasted about 15 minutes and ended when the driver missed a turn in Mineola and crashed into a telephone pole directly outside the courthouse. Foreshadowing. Troopers surrounded the car, guns drawn. Joel Rifkin simply handed them his driver's license and calmly stepped out of the car. Police frisked him, removing an X-Acto knife from his pocket. He didn't resist and cooperated with police, despite his disheveled appearance and erratic driving. He had a thick layer of Noxzema cream smeared across his mustache, the container in the passenger seat. It would quickly become clear why. The troopers started to smell a foul odor coming from the truck. They followed the scent to the bed of the pickup truck where they pulled back a blue tarp to find the rotting corpse of a woman. Their routine traffic violation turned high-speed chase just escalated even further to murder. These 2 state troopers had no idea how twisted it was about to get. Here's a hot tip. If you're going to be dumping a body, make sure your license plate is secure and there's nothing wrong with your car so you don't get pulled over by the cops. This was Joel Rifkin's last victim. You'd think after killing and disposing of nearly 20 women, he could have at least been less of a dumbass. I also have to note that he crashed into a telephone pole outside of the courthouse that would eventually hold his trial. Poetic dumbassery level 97. The Noxzema he used on his mustache was to mask the smell of the rotting corpse he was driving around with. It was a technique he picked up from the Oscar-winning movie Silence of the Lambs, which was released a couple years prior. Apparently, Hannibal Lecter didn't depict how to drive properly in the movie. When the state troopers asked about the body in the bed of the pickup, Joel Rifkin replied, quote, She was a prostitute. I picked her up on Allen Street in Manhattan. I had sex with her. Then things went bad and I strangled her. Do I need a lawyer?" End quote. Rifkin identified the woman as 22-year-old dancer and prostitute Tiffany Bresciani, who happened to be the girlfriend of Dave Insurgent, a member of the 80s punk band Reagan Youth. Rifkin was booked in Hempstead, and detectives began what is described as a marathon interrogation. He described the murder of Tiffany in clinical detail with complete emotional detachment. This led police to discover that they were in the presence of a serial killer. Joel Rifkin lived with his sister and 71-year-old mother in East Meadow, Long Island. As police staked out the house, waiting for the warrant to be issued, Joel's mother received a call from police stating that her son had been detained following a traffic incident. Hours later, his mother would find out the truth on television when detectives would address the media with information about her son, the serial killer. Can you imagine turning on the news and seeing the top story on every channel being, "Your son is a serial killer"? I'm sure it's always shocking when you know the person, like, "Wow, I went to school with a serial killer," or "That's my neighbor." Usually when this happens, it goes one of two ways. Either people who knew the criminals say they always knew something was off about them, or they talk about how they seem so normal and nice. Given Joel Rifkin's history, tendencies, and honestly, his face, I don't think it was the latter. And I also find it extremely suspect that his mom and sister had no idea he was a serial killer, but I'll get to that. For now, let's back up a bit. Joel Rifkin was born on January 20th, 1959, to an unwed couple who put him up for adoption. His birth mother was 20 years old and his biological father was a 24-year-old Army veteran. They were both students and not yet ready to start a family, so they decided to put him up for adoption. Joel was adopted by Benjamin and Jean Rifkin on Valentine's Day when he was just 3 weeks old. 3 years later, Benjamin and Jean adopted a sister, Jan, for Joel. The family moved to East Meadow, Long Island from upstate New York when Joel was around 6 years old. Benjamin Rifkin was a structural engineer, an incredibly intelligent man who was an active member in his community school board and was honored with a seat for life on the Board of Trustees at the landmark East Meadow Public Library. Jean Rifkin was a homemaker and avid gardener, photography enthusiast, and crafter. The Rifkin family blended right into their East Meadow, Long Island town, a community of middle to upper income families who take care of their homes and actively volunteer within their community. Picture a normal, white picket fence American suburban life. Despite the seemingly perfect environment, Joel's childhood would prove to be a key element in shaping him into the serial killer he would inevitably become. From elementary school through high school, Joel was a constant target for bullies. There was something about him that made him an easy target and an outcast. Making friends didn't come easy for him, as he was incredibly shy and passive and wouldn't even fight back or defend himself when being sadistically tormented. It was the 70s and Joel was a typical nerd target. He wore awkward glasses, had high-water pants with white socks, and was nicknamed the Turtle because he was always slouching and moved really slow. He was always excluded from sports and neighborhood games, was a star of every prank and joke, was constantly assaulted, bullies would pull down his pants in front of girls, they'd steal his books and lunch, would hide his clothes during gym, and shove his head in the toilet. One of the bullies gave a statement years later saying Joel was, quote, an abuse unit. He was subtly obnoxious, like his presence annoyed you, end quote. He tried to join the track team to impress his dad, who had been a star athlete in his youth, but the track team nicknamed him Lardass and constantly harassed him. He didn't have much of a romantic life in high school either, but he did have at least 2 dates that ended just as horrifically. One of them was ruined when the track team trapped him in the gym and threw eggs at him, forcing him to call his dad for help. Another date took place at a local pizzeria, but that same track team chased them out and ran after them until they took safety in a nearby library. Because track clearly didn't work out, Joel joined the yearbook club since he loved photography. His camera was immediately stolen. Despite this setback, he dedicated all his time and effort into creating the senior yearbook, only to be excluded from the year-end wrap party. His mother later said that it had left him absolutely devastated. Despite having a tested IQ of 128, which is an above-average score and nearly under the classification of gifted, Joel Rifkin did terribly academically. He barely graduated and was constantly failing his courses. His father was constantly embarrassed by this and would say, quote, "Why can't you do anything to please me?" End quote. Joel had such a struggle with his academic studies, mostly because of an undiagnosed case of dyslexia. The daily torment at the hands of his classmates surely didn't help either. As someone who was constantly bullied in elementary and middle school, I know the harrowing feeling of not wanting to go to class, walk the halls, or look at anyone. It's terrifying, deeply hurtful, and scarring. Joel also went through this in the 70s, where there weren't really regulations or teacher interference like there is now. Those are relatively new, as there was never any help for me in the early 2000s. I hear stories from teacher friends and see how schools are portrayed in the media now, and it's night and day. It's incredible progress, and I'm glad bullying has become such a major and talked about issue to solve and prevent. I'm also just a tiny bit bitter about it because no one gave a single fuck when I was young. But these are the things that shape us, and how we let them affect our future selves is on us. It's made me a stronger and more compassionate human being. Some people don't turn out that way. What he endured on a daily basis was definitely part of what shaped what would come next. I'm not saying that everyone who gets bullied is going to become a serial killer or that this is the entire reason he did what he did, because there's a lot that goes into it, including genetic makeup and brain structure. But I can't think that this wasn't a hard shove into the violent behavior that he would come to display. College did not prove much better for Rifkin. Although the bullying ceased, he continued to fail classes, not show up, and struggle through school and life. He bounced around between the local Nassau Community College and Brockport University. He briefly had a girlfriend who described him as, quote, sweet but always depressed, end quote. Nothing seemed to last long in Rifkin's life. He worked odd jobs through college but couldn't hold one down for long due to his bad hygiene, constantly not showing up for shifts, and general awkwardness. His former boss at a music store said he was, quote, a total piece of work. The guy couldn't even count to 10, end quote. He rented his own apartments but would always end up back living with his parents. He seemed to fail at everything. His photography, his aspiration to be a writer or poet, horticulture, his education, romantic relationships, every job. Because Rifkin couldn't really get dates with women, he started soliciting prostitutes in college. He didn't want to go to college a virgin, so he figured he'd hire a woman instead, and thus began his unravel. Due to his traumatic years in school, suffering at the hands of relentless and cruel bullies, Joel Rifkin retreated into his own little disturbed mind. He began daydreaming of raping and stabbing women and was heavily influenced by Alfred Hitchcock's movie Frenzy, which fueled his obsession with wanting to strangle women. He has said that his fantasies included, quote, some bondage, some rape, and a gladiator type thing with two girls that would fight to the death, end quote. His parents bought him a car around that time, so he started to use it to troll for prostitutes in Hempstead, Long Island. Ben Rifkin, Joel's father, was sick for many years. He was a heavy smoker and had emphysema. In 1986, he was diagnosed with prostate cancer. The following year, in the winter of 1987, he committed suicide to end the pain of cancer. Despite giving a very touching eulogy at his father's funeral, this launched him further into depression. His father's death is what's referred to as a stressor. In 1987, a few months after his father's death, Joel was arrested for soliciting a prostitute in Hempstead. He was able to just pay a fine and hide the incident from his mother. Instead of scaring him straight, this led him to start driving into Manhattan to hire prostitutes instead. Joel was often robbed, mugged, and beat on by prostitutes and their pimps. He spent all his money and time with prostitutes, and despite getting robbed so many times and not having money to pay rent, which would land him back to living with his parents, he continued to hire prostitutes. You may be thinking, wow, this guy just doesn't take a hint or learn a lesson. But this was a compulsion, an impulse, something he just couldn't stop doing. Rifkin could no longer fight back the violent fantasies running through his head, and by March 1989, he escalated to his first murder. His mother was leaving for a few days on a business trip, so he drove out to the East Village in Manhattan at around 10 p.m. and picked up a prostitute who he could only remember as Susie. Heidi Susie Belch was a 25-year-old prostitute and a drug addict. After Joel picked her up, she made him make several stops to buy crack before they drove back to Long Island to Rifkin's home. After what was described as lifeless sex, Susie asked Rifkin to take her out to buy more drugs. Instead, he grabbed a souvenir Howitzer artillery shell that he bought at a flea market for 25 cents and bludgeoned her with it. He said, quote, I just lost control. I stopped when I got tired, end quote. If you don't know what a Howitzer artillery shell is, because I didn't, it's basically an enormous bullet-looking thing that you put in an army tank. I posted a picture of it. If you work in the military or criminal justice, don't come at me for my terrible description. I'm not a ballistics expert. I'm not sure how big the one Rifkin used was, but these things can be as big as your torso and weigh up to 95 pounds. I doubt his was that big because Susi was still alive after he bludgeoned her with it. Susi fought back when Joel tried to move her body. She bit one of his fingers deeply, probably to the bone, before he lived out his true fantasy of strangling her to death. He shoved her body in a plastic garbage bag and cleaned up his living room, cleaning up the blood and signs of struggle. Then he took a nap. Yep, he took a nap while Susi's body lay in a garbage bag in his living room. I guess murdering a woman takes a lot out of a person. When he woke up from his post-murder nap, he dragged her body to the basement, laid her on top of the washing machine and dryer, and began to dismember her corpse using an X-Acto knife. If you remember, when Joel Rifkin was arrested, the police found an X-Acto knife in his pocket. I'm not sure if all my sources got this detail wrong, but it seems really off to me that he dismembered a body using an X-Acto knife. If you don't know what an X-Acto is, it's basically an arts and crafts scalpel. It's a cross between a scalpel and a box cutter in the sense that it's the size of a scalpel, but the blade is like a box cutter blade. I went to art school and I always had one on me, and I can tell you that this thing is used to cut paper and not a whole lot else. If the paper is too thick or the material you're cutting is too coarse, it usually won't cut through or easily. If you've accidentally cut your finger with one of these, it's usually like a deep paper cut. It's not that serious. I just don't know how you could dismember a body with one of these things, especially since the blade is maybe an inch long. Anyways, despite not seeming like a bright guy, Rifkin did take a lot of forensic countermeasures with his first victim. He removed her teeth with pliers and severed her fingertips so that she wouldn't be identified if found. He also decapitated her and shoved her head into an old paint can he had laying around in his basement. The rest of her body parts went into several garbage bags, which he stored in his mother's car. To further ensure she wouldn't be found or identified, he drove to New Jersey, crossing state lines, and dropped her head and legs in the woods near a town called Hopewell. Then he went back to Manhattan and threw her arms and torso into the East River. On March 5, 1989, a few days after murdering Susi, a golfer belonging to the Hopewell Valley Golf Club stumbled upon the paint can that had Susi's head in it when his golf ball sliced into the woods. Despite all his countermeasures, I guess he didn't look around and realize he was dumping a decapitated head at a golf course. Also, imagine you're a preppy white dad playing golf with your buddies or business associates, and you go to get your ball and, oh, what's this paint can doing here on our nice golf course? I'm gonna open it and pass out. He followed the case on TV and in the papers with heightened anxiety as police tried to render photos of her and match them against a list of 700 missing women in the tri-state area. Susi's case remained a cold case until Rifkin confessed in 1993. It would be another year until Joel would murder his next victim. In late 1990, Joel's mom went out of town again, and he picked up Julie Blackbird, a prostitute who he picked up and brought home and has described as having a, quote, pseudo-Madonna look, end quote. He spent the night with her and then drove to an ATM to pull out cash to pay her for her services. When he realized he had no money left in his account, he went home and convinced her to spend the night. At around 9 a.m. the next day, Joel said he was, quote, completely bugging out, end quote, and beat her with a heavy table leg and finally strangled her to death. He said he had considered raping her corpse in tribute to Ted Bundy, but was repulsed by the idea of it. Learning from his mistakes with his first victim, Susi, Joel went to a local hardware store and bought cement and a large mortar pan, which is a container made of steel or hard plastic used to carry things like wet cement, sand, and other building material. Kind of looks like a big tray, like the types used to hold your paint when you're repainting a wall. He dismembered Julie's body and placed her head, arms, and legs in separate buckets, which he weighed down with cement. He placed her torso in a milk crate. Rifkin then drove into Manhattan and dumped her head and torso into the East River, and then dropped her arms and legs into a Brooklyn barge canal. Julie Blackbird's remains were never found. We only know her as one of his victims because of his confession and her diary, which was found in his bedroom. So now we have two women dead at Joel's hand. He had gotten a taste for murder, finally able to live out his sick fantasies and get away with his brutality. He didn't want to stop. and he wouldn't. The only part of his plan he didn't like was the dismemberment. He wanted to find another way to dispose of his victims that didn't involve him doing the gruesome work of cutting them apart. He briefly started his own landscaping business in April of 1991 and rented a space to store his equipment. But Rifkin's obsession with murder had consumed him. It was all he thought about and all he wanted to do. He half-assed his landscaping business, and by the summer he couldn't make rent. He began to use his storage facility as a sort of way station for his victims on his way to dump their bodies. Joel Rifkin's next victim was Barbara Jacobs, a 31-year-old drug-addicted prostitute who he picked up on July 13, 1991. He brought her to his home, had sex, and when she fell asleep, he used the table leg he had killed Julie Blackbird with to beat Barbara Jacobs. After he had beaten her, he strangled her to death. Not wanting to dismember her body, he rolled Barbara Jacobs in plastic tarp and folded her into a cardboard box, which he then put in the back of his mom's Toyota pickup truck. Then drove to the Hudson River and dropped the cardboard box containing her body into the water near a cement plant. Barbara Jacobs was found just hours later by firefighters who were on a training exercise in the Hudson. Unlike when his first victim was found, Rifkin said that Barbara's body being discovered, quote, didn't even faze me, end quote. Barbara Jacobs was buried in Pottersfield Cemetery in an unmarked grave until Rifkin confessed 2 years later. At the time, the coroner had blamed her death on a drug overdose, which makes me think that the coroner was truly a buffoon. She had been beaten and strangled to death and found just a few hours later, so her body was pretty well intact, enough for a coroner to determine that she was murdered. I think because she was an addict and a prostitute, her case was dismissed and she was just not cared about. This is why Joel Rifkin and many other serial killers targeted prostitutes, because they could easily get away with police not asking too many questions. A high-risk lifestyle like prostitution or drug addiction is still a life. They were human beings with lives, families, and were just as important. These women deserve justice. It boggles my mind that a body wrapped in plastic, stuffed in a box, beaten and strangled, and found in the river was concluded as a drug overdose. How does one overdose and stuff themselves into a box and throw themselves over into the Hudson? It's absolutely despicable that a coroner signed off on a report like this. But such is true crime life. We often find stories that include truly absurd coroners, police officers, and lab technicians just being terrible at their jobs and terrible human beings. Anyways, back to our depraved psychopath, Joel Rifkin. You would think that Barbara Jacobs' body being found hours later would deter Rifkin from further violence, but as he said, it didn't faze him. So he kept on going. He started to escalate his murders shortly after Barbara. September 1st, 1991, Mary Ellen Deluca, 22 years old, was killed by Rifkin after complaining about having sex with him after he had bought her crack. She had been missing for a month before her body was found. She was last seen alive at 11 p.m. that night when Rifkin picked her up in Queens and drove her around New York City until the sun came up, spending over $150 for her drugs at various stops along their way to a cheap motel. She had been complaining about wanting more drugs and rushed through having sex with Rifkin. Apparently, he had asked Mary Ellen if she wanted to die, and he claims she said yes, and claims that while he strangled her, quote, she did nothing, just accepted it. It was one of the weird ones, end quote. I'm really sure that happened. Okay. It was now daylight though, and he couldn't drag a dead body out to his car or leave her there. So he took some pointers from his favorite Hitchcock movie, Frenzy, and went out and bought a steamer trunk, which he shoved Deluca's body into. He then drove upstate to a town in Orange County near West Point and left her either in a field or at a rest stop, naked except for her bra. She wasn't found for a month, so decomposition made it impossible to identify her. She was also buried in an unmarked grave until Rifkin's confession years later. September 23rd, 1991, not even a month later, Yeon Lee, a 31-year-old Korean prostitute, was strangled to death by Rifkin. Her body had been put into the same steamer trunk and dumped into the East River. This was the only murder he seemed to show remorse for because he had picked Yeon Lee up once before and apparently liked her. Her body was found soon after, floating past Randall's Island near Harlem River. Her ex-husband was able to identify her body, so she was not buried in an unmarked grave like the others. He seemed to take a break for a few months and didn't strike again until early December 1991. Referred to as Jane Doe No. 1 because Rifkin couldn't remember her name when he confessed, she had been strangled during sex and her body placed in a 55-gallon oil drum, which was then dumped into the East River. Apparently, Joel had picked up Jane Doe No. 1 in Manhattan, strangled her during oral sex, then drove back to Long Island, at least a 30-minute drive, with her dead body slumped in the passenger seat. He dropped off the body at his work storage place, drove out to Westbury to a recycling plant he used to work at, stole an oil drum, and returned to his work storage place. After stuffing her body into the oil drum, he drove to a junkyard in the Bronx and rolled her into the East River. While he was about to leave, 2 patrolmen stopped him and accused him of illegal dumping into the river. He somehow managed to convince them that he was just collecting junk instead, and they let him off with a warning. Can you imagine that? He drove with a dead body next to him. He was stopped by patrol after dumping said body, and no one caught him. It's no wonder he kept on going at such a high kill rate until he was stopped by police for his license plate violation. He must have thought he was the luckiest psychopath on the planet. Joel found the oil drum concept to be a great idea and continued to use it for at least 4 more victims. A few days before Christmas, Rifkin strangled 28-year-old Lorraine Orvieto during sex. He placed her body in an oil drum and threw it into the Coney Island Creek. Her body was found 6 months later by a fisherman, and 2 months before her family filed a missing persons report. About a week later, on January 2, 1992, Rifkin killed 39-year-old Mary Ann Holloman and stuffed her in an oil drum as well, dumping in the same place as Lorraine. Her body wouldn't be discovered until July, a few days before passers-by would find Lorraine Orvieto's skeletal remains. Dental records helped identify Mary Ann, and her body was given a proper burial by her family. At this point, we're barely at the halfway point of his victims. Police suspected that they had a serial killer at large, but unfortunately, New York City at that time was a rampant crime spree, and they were dealing with at least 2,000 murders a year. And as I mentioned earlier, unfortunately, another dead prostitute wasn't high on their list of priorities, so they did nothing. Joel Rifkin claimed there was one more oil drum victim, but couldn't remember her name or where he threw her body in the Harlem River. Despite his favor of the oil drum, he decided to switch things up a bit by the spring. His next victim was claimed in either April or May of 1992. Her name was Iris Sanchez. She was 25 years old when Rifkin strangled her to death. This time, he simply drove out to JFK Airport and left her body under an old mattress in an abandoned lot. Her body was still there over a year later after Joel's arrest. Joel had to draw a map for police to find her body. May 25th, 1992, Anna Lopez, a 33-year-old mother of 3, was strangled to death and her body left in the woods off I-84 in upstate New York. She was killed on the same day that the remains of Jane Doe No. 2 were found. Jane Doe No. 2 was strangled to death sometime in the winter of 1991. Parts of her body were discovered in an oil drum floating in Brooklyn. Violet ONeal, a 21-year-old, was murdered in June 1992 in Rifkin's family home. He dismembered her in the bathtub and wrapped the body parts in plastic. He disposed of her body parts in various rivers and canals in New York City. Violet's torso was found floating in the Hudson. A few days later, the rest of her body parts were found inside of a suitcase. Mary Catherine Williams, 31, was also murdered at Rifkin's family home on October 2, 1992. Her remains wouldn't be found until the following December in Yorktown, New York. Jenny Soto, 23, was a fighter. On November 16, 1992, Rifkin strangled Jenny, but she fought back. She broke off all 10 of her fingernails while scratching at Joel's face and neck, clawing and trying to escape. He snapped her neck. Her body was found floating in the Harlem River the next day. Police suspected her ex-con boyfriend murdered her. Jenny Soto's fight for her life and damage to Joel's face left him with a shock, and one that paused his acceleration period. It would be at least 3 months until he struck again. Leah Evans, a 28-year-old mother of 2, was murdered on February 27, 1993. Rifkin did something new and buried her body in the woods out on Long Island. Her body would be found 3 months later. Lauren Marquez, 28, was strangled to death on April 2, 1993. Her body left in the Pine Barrens on Long Island. That brings us to our alleged final victim, Tiffany Bresciani. She is the woman that took down Joel Rifkin. She was the body in the pickup that the police smelled when they pulled him over for his traffic violation. Tiffany was a Louisiana girl who had moved to New York City with dreams of acting and dancing like many do. Unfortunately, she ended up getting hooked on heroin and dancing in strip clubs and tricking in cars. Rifkin picked her up on June 24, 1993. She was his second prostitute of the night and his fourth in 2 days. This was customary for him. He would often double up in a night and was clearly very addicted to hiring prostitutes. He wouldn't kill them all. His selection process was very erratic and random. Rifkin drove them to the New York Post parking lot and strangled her at 5:30 a.m. He then drove back to Long Island with Tiffany laid out on the back seat of his mother's car, dead. Reports from his trial suggested that at some point he had one of her legs on his lap as he drove. He stopped at a few stores along the way, buying rope and tarp, and by the time he got home, Tiffany was wrapped up in tarp and hidden in the trunk. So just picture this. Not only is he driving around with a dead body in the back seat, he also stops and parks his car at several parking lots to go shopping for supplies. How did no one realize? And at that point, it was daylight out. Nobody saw a dead body? I'm not done though. This is where it gets truly ridiculous. He goes home and his mom demands her car keys and leaves for half an hour to go shopping with the corpse in the trunk. She apparently never knew. Joel described this as, quote, a little anxiety attack, end quote, which is wild because I get massive anxiety attacks over truly little things, and he legit had a corpse in his mother's trunk, and she just drove off with it, and he was, I'm okay, it's fine, I guess. Joel then does the super smart thing of dumping Tiffany's body in his cluttered garage, leaving her body in a wheelbarrow for 3 days. In June. New York summers are hot as hell, guys, and he just left this body in his garage to rot and decompose for 3 days in the summer heat. He spent the next 3 days in a fugue state, working on his pickup truck and just ignoring the reeking smell coming from his garage. His luck finally ran out when he drove off to dispose of Tiffany's body. As you know, he was pulled over for leading police on a high-speed chase because his license plate had fallen off. Leaving the corpse in the garage for 3 days ended up being his downfall. So now we're all caught up. He's been arrested, and now he is at the police station. Joel Rifkin was interrogated for 8 hours. When he was first detained, detectives asked about the body, and he replied, quote, she was a prostitute. I picked her up on Allen Street in Manhattan. I had sex with her, then things went bad, and I strangled her. Do you think I need a lawyer? End quote. No one recorded the interrogation, and Joel didn't have a lawyer present at the time. He claimed he asked for a lawyer over 20 times, but the written transcript said he was offered one and declined, which is likely just the police covering their tracks. I don't blame them. You have a serial killer sitting in front of you confessing, you're not going to miss that opportunity. Joel opened up like a book to detectives. After admitting he strangled Tiffany, the body they found in his car, the cops were able to ask if it had happened before, and he said she was number 17. Then he just surrendered every name, every detail, every date he could remember. He described 17 murders, wrote out the names he could remember, and drew maps to where the bodies were left. Soon after Joel started talking, police were staked out in front of his mother's house. She went out to confront them, and they told her that her son was detained for a traffic incident and then jailed for, quote, a crime, end quote, but wouldn't tell her anything else. Like we discussed earlier, Jean Rifkin learned that her son was a serial killer on TV at 9 a.m. that morning. She then called her lawyer, who gave her Robert Sale's number, a criminal attorney. Robert Sale called the precinct at 3:30 p.m. to tell police to stop questioning his client without him present. They obviously did not stop. It took Sale another hour to get to the precinct. Honestly, this guy sounds like a terrible lawyer. And by that time, Joel had finished with his gruesome recount of his killing spree. By 8 p.m., police were able to hand Jean Rifkin a search warrant and begin their 6-hour investigation of Joel Rifkin's family home. Here's the thing about serial killers. They keep trophies from their victims. Usually it's personal items they had on them at the time of their death, like jewelry or IDs. Sometimes it's body parts or teeth. Joel was no different. He took trophies from every single woman he killed, multiple trophies, right after he murdered them. In Joel's bedroom, police found dozens of IDs, driver's licenses, and credit cards, photographs Joel Rifkin took of unidentified women, 75 pieces of women's jewelry, piles of women's clothing, makeup cases, hair accessories, a curling iron, prescription drug bottles prescribed to various women, drug syringes, wallets, and purses. Authorities found 228 trophies, one report claiming more than 1,000 pieces, all from his 4-year murder spree. Mary Deluca and Jenny Soto's driver's licenses were among the things found. Most of the items could be matched to victims of cold cases. His room also had books on the unidentified Green River Killer, news clippings about the New York serial slayer Arthur Shawcross, a large collection of books on serial killers, and violent pornographic pictures and movies about sadism. Didn't get any better when they made their way to the garage. Detectives followed the scent of foul decomposition to a wheelbarrow, where they extracted 3 ounces of human blood. Forensics and various medical examiners would come to determine that there was no way this fresh blood could have been from Tiffany, Rifkin's last victim, but that there was a victim number 18, one he would never confess to, and a body that would never be found. There were tools with blood all over them, and a chainsaw with blood and human flesh stuck to the blades. A pair of women's underwear was on the floor, near a pile of tarp and rope. Joel's neighbors had recalled foul odors coming from the garage and just thought it was fertilizer and insecticide for his landscaping job. Guys, here's a hot tip. If you smell something foul and rotting coming from someone's garage, always assume it's a dead body. Now, remember when we first started this journey and I said I found it ridiculous that his mom had no idea what he was up to? If neighbors can smell rotting corpses in your garage from the sidewalk or their own property, how in the world could his mom not smell that living in the same house? Did you really buy the whole fertilizer thing? I've never personally smelled a rotting corpse, but I imagine it doesn't smell like fertilizer or chemicals. And another thing, Jean Rifkin was mostly a homemaker. Did she never go into the garage to tidy up or into Joel's room? Think back to living with your parents. Didn't it feel like your mom was just always in your room for one reason or another? Did she not see the piles of women's clothing and bags and all of his trophies? Did she never go into the garage for anything at all? Not even batteries or garbage? The laundry machine was in the garage, if you remember. Did she never do laundry? You really think the sloppy serial killer did all the laundry for the whole family? I don't buy this at all. It just doesn't really add up for me that she was this oblivious when it was happening in her own home. There was blood on the tools and in a wheelbarrow and on a damn chainsaw, and she just never went into that room. Joel was consumed by his bloodlust, and murder was all he ever thought about or wanted to do. That's something that's not very easy to hide, and he didn't try all that hard to hide any of it. So how could his mom not realize, hey, I think there's something off about my kid, or wow, the garage smells pretty ripe. Maybe I should go and check what's going on in there, or open the garage door to air out this fertilizer smell. I don't know, you guys. Maybe my parents are different, but having a rotten corpse smell and living with a serial killer seems like something a parent should maybe pick up on. One of the reports I read said that his sister lived in that house too. So, okay, maybe chalk up his mom's oblivion to old age or whatever. But his sister was around his age. You can't possibly tell me that 2 women ignored those smells, his behavior, and all the fucking trophies in his bedroom. No one wanted to know where he was going at night or why there was blood everywhere in the garage when he was allegedly a landscaper. Last I checked, grass doesn't bleed, you guys. I just have a lot of questions for Jean, and I find it really suspect that she didn't know anything was going on with her own son. It's trial time. Let's fast forward to November of 1993. From the time he was arrested, Joel Rifkin's story is pretty much a who's a bigger dumbass lawyer party. Rifkin fired Robert Sale, his first lawyer hired by his mom. No surprise there. When a client calls at 9 a.m. and you show up at almost 5 p.m., you gotta go. Joel instead hired law partners Michael Soshnick and John Lawrence. Soshnick was a former DA for Nassau County and was apparently a top-notch criminal attorney. John Lawrence had zero criminal law experience. What could go wrong? I'm about to have some opinions. Joel was arraigned in Nassau County for the murder of Tiffany Bresciani, the woman found in his truck. He pleads not guilty. How are you going to explain that one, honey? She was dead in your truck and you admitted it and blood was all over your garage. So the suppression hearing begins in November of 1993. It lasts 4 months and it is a hot mess. Soshnick, the famous criminal lawyer and DA, proves to be a level 86 dumbass and terrible at his job. He tries to get Rifkin's whole-ass confession suppressed, including his confession to murdering Tiffany, on the grounds that the state troopers had no probable cause to search his truck. Oh, honey, when a guy is leading police on a high-speed chase, has Noxzema on his mustache, and there's a rotting smell coming out of the bed of the pickup, I'm pretty sure that's probable cause to lift up a suspicious-looking tarp. So we're 2 months into the suppression hearing, and Joel is offered a plea deal. 46 years to life in exchange for pleading guilty to all 17 murders. He turned it down because he was convinced his lawyers could make an insanity plea work for him. Spoiler alert, he should have taken that deal. Back to our level 86 dumbass, Soshnick. He continuously offended the judge by showing up late to court or not even showing up at all, and when he did show up, he was usually unprepared. By March, Judge Wexner was like, I'm done with you, you're a dumbass, and pulled the plug on the suppression hearings. He rejected the defense's motions and set the trial to begin in April. Here's another hot tip. Don't piss off the judge. They literally hold the gavel. I imagine that's rule number 1 in law school. Plot twist, Joel fires level 86 dumbass Soshnick. Who would have seen that one coming? He doesn't hire another lawyer though. He keeps Lawrence. Yeah, the guy who's never done this before. The trial of Joel Rifkin begins on April 11th, 1994. He decides to plead not guilty by reason of temporary insanity. Yep, 4 years of temporary insanity. That's the best they came up with. Obviously, the jury didn't buy that nonsense and justice prevailed. They found him guilty of murder and reckless endangerment and sentenced him to 25 years to life. But wait, Cece, 25 years only? He killed 17 women. Don't worry, I'm not finished. That was just for the murder of Tiffany and for the high-speed chase. I got you guys. Let's keep rolling out these convictions. Joel gets transferred to Suffolk County and stands trial for the murders of Evans and Marquez. His confession suppression attempt was once again rejected. Like I said, don't piss off a judge. Joel pled guilty this time for both murders and received 2 more consecutive terms of 25 to life. We're at 75 years to life now. But wait, there's more! He then goes on to stand trial in Queens and Brooklyn. It goes about the same way. By the time all of the trials were done, Joel Rifkin, New York's most prolific serial killer, was found guilty of murdering 9 women and was sentenced to a total of 203 years in prison. He is currently serving his sentence at the Clinton Correctional Facility in New York with a bunch of other depraved scum. It's a shame that he wasn't charged for all 17 murders, but I'm sure it came down to evidence and body recovery and identification. 203 years seems like a good enough sentence to me, though. A lot of Joel Rifkin's life and crimes truly came down to dumb luck. All in all, he was extremely sloppy with his murders, his lack of cleaning up evidence, how quickly bodies were discovered, driving around with dead women in the passenger back seat, police questioning him for dumping bodies in the river. It was just the dumbest luck that he didn't get caught any sooner and went on a 4-year murder spree, taking the lives of at least 17 women. Honestly, researching and writing about Joel Rifkin really annoyed me because he was such a level 97 dumbass and should have been caught sooner. Nothing about this psychopath was creative or genius. He was just a sadistic piece of shit who used the fact that police didn't care about prostitutes as a way to carry out his twisted sexual fantasies and desire for power and control. I should mention that some people call him Joel the Ripper, which I also find extremely lacking of creativity. Chris Cuomo, the CNN reporter and brother of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo, sat down with Joel Rifkin a couple of years ago for an interview. I've included the link to that on the blog, but here are some excerpts from Joel 25 years after his arrest. In regards to his first victim, Susi, quote, Basically, until I picked it up and swung it, I believed I never would, end quote, referencing the fact that he never thought he would actually murder someone. Cuomo, these women weren't a threat to you. Rifkin, that's one of the biggest mysteries to me. I could be with 3 women in a night and the 3rd woman would end up dead. Why not the first 2? Clueless. I just don't know. Cuomo posed the question of why did Rifkin choose to kill his victims in the way he did when there are much easier ways to kill a person, to which Rifkin agreed and responded that the way he did it was more intimate and you could feel everything, that it was the highest you could get in that manner and the biggest rush of adrenaline. According to the interview, Rifkin is hopeful that the reason for his murderous tendencies has to do with an imbalance and dysfunction of the frontal lobe part of his brain, affecting his conscience and impulse controls. A few criminal psychologists weigh in on that and in the short documentary saying that there could have been 2 reasons for his actions. The first was that he was a sexual sadist, and the second was that he believed his birth mother, who gave him up for adoption, had been a prostitute because no other type of woman would have given him up, and every time he killed a prostitute, he was really projecting and killing his own mother over and over. I also learned that apparently, if a pregnant woman smokes during her pregnancy and gives birth to a boy, that boy is 3 times more likely to grow up and be a violent criminal. Science is wild. It was also revealed that Rifkin had slept with at least 300 different prostitutes during his killing spree years, and many people in the psychology and law enforcement world believe he had killed way more than 17 women. Definitely watch the interview. It's interesting to hear his recount, lack of remorse, and evaluations by professionals. It's about 30 minutes long and definitely worth a watch. I was also surprised to see what he looks like now, and like most serial killers, he doesn't appear like a threatening psychopath, but, Ted Bundy. Before closing out this episode, here are the names of Joel Rifkin's 17 women one more time. Heidi Susie Balch, Julie Blackbird, Barbara Jacobs, Mary Ellen Deluca, Yun Lee, Jane Doe No. 1, Lorraine Orvieto, Mary Ann Holloman, Jane Doe No. 2, Iris Sanchez, Anna Lopez, Violet ONeal, Mary Catherine Williams, Jenny Soto, Leah Evans, Lauren Marquez, Tiffany Bresciani, and any other unidentified women who died at his hand. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed our trip back to 1993 to meet Joel Rifkin, New York's most prolific serial killer. As always, please subscribe, review, and check out my Instagram page @CrimeInTheCity for pictures of the killers we talk about. Bye!